unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Webb Keane, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, also the author of a number of books, one called Ethical Life, Natural and Social Histories, another one called Christian Moderns, Freedom and Fetish in the Mission Encounter, and most recently this book called Animals, Robots, Gods, Adventures in the Moral Imagination. Welcome, Webb.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I think in the book you referenced Max Weber and Durkheim, and they both seem to agree, right, when they were back founding sociology as a profession, that they sort of predicted that the modern world would be completely devoid of enchantment, right? I mean, and it was sort of, I guess, mournful and wistful in a way, concerned about the spiritual poverty of the modern world. But I think you and other anthropologists, and in this book, you go through and cite a whole bunch of your fellow anthropologists. I think what you've pointed out is that isn't completely true, and that we have these sources of enchantment in the modern world. And I think probably what triggered the writing of this book was the way in which we're all kind of transfixed by artificial intelligence, right? And, when we go to ChatGPT, and in many ways, it's kind of like the Greeks going to the Oracle of Delphi, or the, folks like the ones that you study in Indonesia going to some kind of shaman or spiritual guide to try to find out, right, what's going on. And we really don't know what's going on beneath the hood, and we're kind of fascinated, and we have a tendency to anthropomorphize these gurus in a box, so to speak. So,
gurus in a box I think, really captures it very nicely, Greg. Thank you. I think you are spot on here that the story that we have told ourselves, at least we sort of Western academics have told ourselves about modernity, is that we're in this sort of relentless march towards an ever more sort of soulless, I think what Max Weber would have thought of as this soulless, bureaucratized, totally rational world, one devoid of emotions, of feelings, of spirit, of wonder, of a sense of even a sense of excitement, perhaps. I mean, there's some ways, it was almost about boredom. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that first got me started on what led to this book was reading about, like everyone, I've sort of been following developments in AI and other forms of new technology like robotics. Through the media, how often people who would seem to pride themselves in their rationality, in being scientific, in being hard-headed and secular and rational, people for whom their sort of highly rationalistic model of intelligence is the supreme virtue, and they're really proud of it. Silicon Valley guys who have, take these measures of rationality. I'm really good at playing chess. I'm really good at designing code, and who take these as the measures of all that is greatest about humanity. When they started talking about things like ChatGPT, weirdly enough, theological language would start to creep up would start to sort of almost against their will would start to show up in their talk. I mean, an example I mentioned early in the book is Elon Musk, back when he was just, nothing more than the richest guy in the world and a successful entrepreneur. And he would say that AI is becoming godlike. And he was not alone in this. There was someone else who said that ChatGPT is becoming a god, and it wants me to be its prophet. And this is not like some flaky person, out in the wilderness. These are people based in the world of Silicon Valley, people who take science and rationality to be the highest virtues. So I really got curious about what on earth is going on here. And as you say, part of it is about the mysteriousness of, it seems like magic.
But also, it seems like there is a distinction between what people will profess that they believe when pushed and the way in which they behave, right? So, in economics, we have this distinction between stated preferences and revealed preferences. And I think, as an anthropologist, you are particularly well suited for observing sort of differences between the implied beliefs, right, and what people profess, right? So, people will say, "Hey, I know that this thing is just a bunch of code," but then they'll behave in ways as if it is something human-like. And I think you point out a couple other examples, like where, when you push these hunters, right, um, and you ask them, "Look, do you really think that the bear is like a human?" And they'll say, "Well, maybe not, but I have to act that way," and they act that way, right? I mean, is
Mhm.
do anthropologists are they really particularly well suited for kind of highlighting these differences?
Yeah, I think we are, because of the nature of how we do our research, which is that we don't rely on what people tell us. Of course, we talk to people all the time in our research, in our field work. We talk to people all the time. We listen very carefully to what they say, but I think one of the key differences between what we do and what other social scientists do is we actually live with them and take part in their lives. And so that way you catch people, not just what people say, but what they do. And not just what they put into words, but what they hint at and imply. An example that one of my favorite examples of this is that there are many societies in and around New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, which are well known among anthropologists for people saying things like this. So you go to a feast, and one chief brings a big pig and presents it to another chief. And then the anthropologist says, "God, why did he do that?" And the other chief, the guy who received the pig, will say, "How should I know? I can't see into the hearts of other people. I don't know what's in other people's minds." And then the anthropologist dutifully writes down, "They have no theory of mind." And so a colleague of mine was, after a couple of years living in one of these places, realizes, they'll say this to you, and then now it's the middle of the night, and you're sitting around the fire, and you've had it's late at night, and everyone's laying their hair down, and they're gossiping. And what is the gossip all about? It's like, you know, uh, he gave me this little pig. You know what I mean? I mean, he could have given me a big pig, but no, he gave me this little one. What is he? I know what he's up to. He's trying to instead. And in fact, they're imputing, thoughts to people all the time, but they don't, but they have very strong ethical protocols against essentially going on the public record that, your intentions and your thoughts are not opaque. They're not invisible to me, but they're off limits. It's private. It's a private space that I'm not supposed to go into. You can only find that thing out if you find out things like that if you really live with people for a long time. What do people say when they let their guard down? What are people not saying at all, but is implicit in how they sit, how they seat themselves around the table, who gets to sit where, how they walk, how they farm a field. You learn all sorts of things that sometimes it's things that are just so obvious that it would never occur to anyone to put them into words.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember the first time I
Yeah.
read Clifford Geertz. I mean, it was like eye-opening experience, right? To realize that there's this entirely different way of inhabiting the world, right? As this detached participant slash observer. I mean,
Mhm.
it's really a remarkable experience. And I don't think you can look at any aspect of the world the same way, even, your own immediate surroundings, once you've sort of realized that you can snap on that lens.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the people that I've always been very interested in was a sociologist slash anthropologist named Irving Goffman, who was
Oh yeah,
very
he was
famous in the '60s, and
yeah.
he's still quite influential among people who study social interaction and conversations. And what's interesting about Goffman is he mostly wrote about us. He was basically writing about most of the time white middle class North Americans. He was Canadian, but did all his professional life in the U.S. And he's writing about us, but he's writing about us. He's noticing all the things that we weren't fully aware of until someone drew it to our attention. In a way, it's like some stand-up comics do this too. You ever notice how? And it's kind of excruciating. Like, there's a reason why we don't want to notice some of the things about how we interact with one another, face saving, making excuses for ourselves and so forth. But it really turns on being there, being in the flow of things. So, people say, well, you don't have large surveys, and you don't do large N statistical analyses. And say, yeah, but what we have sort of one basic tool in our toolkit, and that's learning how to get along with other people. And it's a very fundamental tool.
Well,
but now, how does this come back to magic? I'll say is that you mentioned revealed preference. You might say the equivalent of that in what I was finding in the way people respond to AI is that. Well, here's an analogy. The analogy is this: an astronomer knows perfectly well that the sun does not rise in the east, but you talk to them when they're not on the job, and they're going to say the sun rises in the east, because that's how we experience it. The physicist or the engineer, if their car breaks down when they're in a hurry to get to an important meeting, they're going to start cursing the car. They may even kick it. They'll treat it as if it were an animate being. Now, of course, officially they don't believe that. Indeed, they don't believe that. But this is the nature of our experience often, and our sort of intuitive responses to things often deviate from the official story. So when people interact with AI, they may know what the official story is, but and the vast majority of people who interact with it, in fact, do not know what the official story is. And they're the ones who are, I think, in many ways going to set the agenda. They treat it as this kind of magical thing. It knows me better than I know myself. And I can't explain why.
Well, I mean, the book is mostly about ethics, right? And that is your domain. And you said in the book somewhere, why is it that we think that moral philosophers are the ones that have a monopoly on thinking about ethics? And maybe the lawyers as well might have something to say about that, but anthropology has a lot to say about it. And in particular, I think what you're looking at in this book is, how do these different societies and cultures think about what constitutes a moral subject, right? In other words, what are the limits of, and this seems coextensive with the extent to which we think of these parts of the world as being human or human-like, right? So that, our capacity to anthropomorphize is what sets the limit of the universe of moral subjects, and that boundary seems to blur and move and differ from society to society. So I guess the question is, why should anthropologists step into this discussion? Right? What do they have to offer on the world of ethics?
Well, so that's a really good question, Greg, and I think there are two. The answer has two parts. The first part is that I take moral. I mean, some as the expression goes, some of my best friends are moral philosophers, and I've learned a lot from them. I take them very seriously. And just yesterday, I gave a presentation of this book at our law school here at Michigan. So I have some fellow travelers in legal theory as well, in the law school. So why not just leave it to them? So the first part of the answer is our stock and trade from the very beginning of the profession has been to widen the scope of what we know about human beings. The thing that most medical ethics, most moral philosophy. There's currently a small and growing industry of ethics, AI ethics and robotic ethics. It's generated almost entirely from inside what I believe it was some psychologist. I've taken the expression from some psychologists. What we call the weird world, by which means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. These are.
I think it was Joe Heinrich really that popularized.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So, but in creating that expression, he was very much picking up on an anthropological idea, which is that people from our world are a tiny, tiny sliver of what humanity is today. And if you look at even today, and if you look at the broader scope of human, they're just a terrible sample size. They're a terrible sample of, if you want to make claims about the humans, you've really got to broaden your scope. That even today, most human beings are not Western educated, part of a Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic world. And if you look at the scope of human history, throughout most of history, until very recently, nobody was part of this world. So you want to make claims about, what is human morality, you've really got to broaden your scope. And that's always been our stock in trade. It's just that we talk about all humans, not just, European civilization or even Chinese civilization, which is, even the typical sample of non-Western philosophy comes from highly educated elites sustained in sultanic courts or imperial palaces and so forth, not from rice farming peasants or in the backcountry. The second reason that I think we have something to contribute is that we do not, by and large, we seek out moral and ethical life as it is situated within and made possible by all of the social and political and economic and cultural conditions that people inhabit in the particular time and particular place in which they live. So one of the things I say in the book is if you're looking for inhabitable, feasible, ethical worlds, moral ways of living, you can't just sort of sit back and think about, well, how should this be? Let's imagine some perfectly just system. You cannot be a Carmelite nun unless you inhabit a world where there's such a thing as a monastery, where there's a theological system that explains why monasteries are a good thing, where there's a political and economic system that supports the existence of monasteries, and where there's a society that places a high value on them.
So you can't distill it down to a set of moral propositions, in other words.
Moral propositions are great, but they have to be, to be livable, they have to exist in a world that makes them possible and sustains them. So, you can't be the values of a Mongolian warrior could not be more different from those of a Carmelite nun. But then you need a cavalry, you need, again, a social system that supports them, that places a high value in them, and so forth. And to understand what makes ethics viable, you really need to understand the sort of the multi-dimensional, highly complex set of contextual factors that sustain it. And that's what we do. That's our job.
Yeah, I remember there's one example in the book that I really liked where someone brought the trolley problem to a culture. I can't remember which one.
In Madagascar, yes.
Yeah, and they said, okay, so, 1 or 5, and they said, well, who are they, right? And
yeah,
they couldn't answer the question. And this reminded me, I remember one of my first executive programs that I did in what we might call an emerging market, and I was in Kazakhstan, and I was doing an example, standard economics. I was doing basic economics, and I said, okay, which is better, 2 horses or 3 horses? I figured, and I was trying to explain like, marginal benefit or something. And no one would answer the question. They're like, well, tell me about the horses. It's like, oh, they're just the same. He's like, no, 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 they're never the same. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
like, what color are they? I'm like, who cares what color they are? Like, you know, how old are they? I don't care. Like, who cares? Like, I need to see their teeth. And I couldn't, I got so frustrated because I just wanted to move on with this highly abstract example. And I realized they weren't having any of it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly it. So that we live our lives under concrete circumstances, and it's fascinating, and it can be very useful to abstract from those circumstances. But at the end of the day, where we live when we're at home is in the world of very concrete, specific circumstances, and it's not just that the trolley the Malagasy people wanted to know, well, who are they? Because they live in a world where there's no such thing as anonymous strangers, and where there's no such thing as people who have no past with one another, or who have no future with one another. And part of the way the trolley example works is that it presupposes not just anonymity, but the fact that that sole individual who's making that decision all by themselves, which is also rare if you think about it, has no past with these people, and whatever he or she does is going to have no consequences for them later down the line in its purest form, in the early form. Of course, I understand the value of thought experiments, but they have there are things you can do with them, but I think they can be misleading as well. They can, something that's easy to do in a thought experiment is not necessarily a good model for how to understand what people actually do.
Well, so a lot of the book is about these boundaries between the human and the non-human, and of course, this exists temporally. It exists across species and across objects and so forth. And one part that I found fascinating was how we tend to anthropomorphize different types of animals, to a greater or lesser extent. And it does depend on the culture. So here in the US, of course, dogs are basically,
Our best friends.
honorary humans, right? But you also talk about how, horse trainers, and I spent a lot of time around horses, horse trainers, the most effective horse trainers are the ones that can sort of think like a horse, right? And the ones I did an interview with Matt Burns, who writes on dogs, and he just bought a cow, and he said I needed to think like a cow. Gregory Burns, I'm sorry, had to think like a cow in order to make any headway with this cow. But when you're doing that, when you're trying to think like a cow or think like a dog, you're effectively injecting some kind of element of human cognition into them, right? You can't do this without some degree of anthropomorphism, but it also requires that you remove yourself from the human way of thinking. It's a very interesting and delicate intellectual exercise. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that and how that happens. It seems to be a universal human capacity, but it manifests itself in different ways.
Yeah, well, I think it is, anthropologists are a little nervous about talking about universals, but I do think anthropomorphism is universally, I think the way I would put it, it is a universally available propensity that we can tap into and take advantage of and run with in different directions. Or we can ignore it, right? You could try to be, no, I'm going to be hard-headed about this and avoid it. But it is a propensity that everyone has available for playing with as a thought experiment, making use of in practice, as I think horse trainers do. I have to say this, the thinking like a cow has been part of my own experience. So when I was a college kid, I worked on a ranch in Nevada one summer, and they hazed me mercilessly because I was a city boy and, total duffer. But I got pretty good by the end of the summer. We were rounding up cattle, and the foreman, who'd been just riding me mercilessly all summer long, and he looks at me, he says, "Oh, Webb," he says, "you got the makings of a cowboy." And I kind of sit a little taller in the saddle. I'm feeling good about myself. And I said, gee, Ted, what does that take? And he says, well, you got to be able to think like a cow. Like the wind goes out of my sails. Okay, well, there you go. But the truth is, when I think people like horse trainers or hunters, I write in the book as well about traditional hunters in places like Siberia and the Yukon. You can't be a good hunter if you can't, to some extent, imagine your way into the mind of the prey. Because you have to be able to imagine, where would it be? What's it going to do next? I mean, if you can't do that, you're not likely to be as successful as someone who can. Does that mean you can't tell the difference between the way a bear or an elk or a horse thinks and the way you think? No, I don't think it's about being delusional. I think it's about being imaginative. And so, in some sense, you are meeting the animal halfway, because you're not trying to. You're not imagining that it thinks just like you do. Rather, you're trying to imagine, what would I be doing if I were it, or what does it need? What do I need to do in order to communicate with it? So there's an example I use in the book from an ethologist who worked with I think it was with baboons, and she has this wonderful account of trying to get physically close to this group, and they run away. And finally, she starts noticing how they communicate with one another, and she starts kind of mimicking them. She's not pretending to be a baboon, and she's not going to fool them into thinking she's a baboon. But what she's done is she's indicated to them that I am a kind of being, a kind of creature that you can communicate with. And they let her get closer and began to interact with her. And then when she did something wrong, they'd hiss at her and snarl. But she says, but now we're talking to one another, educating me about proper behavior, because I'm listening to them, and they can tell that I'm listening to them. So one way you might think about, say, the horse trainer is not mind reading. The horse trainer doesn't really know what a horse thinks, but the horse trainer is inviting the horse into a shared moral universe, essentially, and saying, look, we're working on this collaboratively to figure out what's the right way to behave. What should you do? And how can I communicate that with you? And if I screw up, how are you going to communicate with me? So we're developing this space in between us. So the anthropomorphism is not delusion. It's a kind of playful form of imagination, I think.
Well, I mean, these traditional hunters, they seem to have more respect and give more agency and humanity even to the animals that they kill than a typical consumer of, boneless chicken breasts down at the Safeway. And yet it would seem like it would be harder to sort of eat, these creatures when you inject some degree of humanity, right? Because you're turning them into moral agents. So how do these cultures reconcile that, right? Because if you're admitting it into the domain of moral agency, then doesn't that also come along with certain obligations and certain ethical norms and guidelines that are absent as long as you just see this as a piece of inert meat?
Yeah, I think it does. So here's an example from the Yukon, or the Yukon of the Arctic, sort of northern Canada, and that is, you're hunting a bear while it's hibernating. Before you lure it, or before you go into its hiding place, or you lure it out and wake it up, you have to explain to it why you're doing what you're doing. So what you're doing essentially is you're treating it as someone for whom your actions are significant and whose death is significant, in ways that also force the hunter to recognize, essentially take responsibility for taking a life. So they still have to take a life, because, in fact, many of these traditional hunters live in places where you don't have a lot of options. It's not like they're often places where, say, farming is not viable. Places very close to the Arctic. You like it or not, you have to kill in order to live. But you don't do it as a neutral, objective consumer of protein. You do it as someone who takes responsibility for the fact of killing, acknowledges that it's heavy. Some hunters of bears will say, bears are so much like humans in certain ways. And I think much as we might think of, say, dogs as being much like humans in certain ways, that it it breaks my heart that I have to do this, but at least they're acknowledging that. Right. So that, I mean, we kill animals, I mean, the hamburgers used to be animals, but they're produced and sold in such a way that it's very easy to forget that, and to take, in some sense, to have no sense of responsibility for what you've done.
Right. So, I mean, we have this sort of Cartesian ability in the West to sort of draw this clear line between, humans and other animals. But we also have the ability to draw a clear line between kind of living and dead, right? So there's a moment where, your grandma goes from being your beloved grandma to a, hunk of meat full of organs and so forth. And, that boundary line is something that's, even though it might seem clear at first, it's actually not quite that clear. Right? And I love this story about how the medical professionals, right? They also, even though they might say that in theory, they have a difficult time executing in practice. And so you actually switch teams when the organ harvesting team and the patient care team, like they need to kind of move them. They kind of need to rotate them. And I didn't know about this because I thought doctors had this sort of capacity to just flip a switch, but even doctors can't do it.
It's fascinating. No, when I read this, because I hope it's clear that I'm drawing very on research from many people. I didn't do all the research in this book. This is an attempt at synthesis. So the thing about transplants is, in most cases, most organs can only be transplanted if the heart is still beating. Because the minute the heart stops beating and blood stops circulating, they start to decay very rapidly. So you really have to move in there, essentially, while the patient is still warm. And it can be, I mean, it just seems like you're cutting open a living person. It's just horrible. And the way they cope with this is that they will bring in the team that was the life support team that was keeping this person alive is pulled off the case, and the transplant team is brought in. And what's interesting is both teams see themselves as lifesavers. It's just that they're saving different lives. So the first team is, they take the person there on the, I don't know, on the bed or whatever, in the gurney, to be a human being whose life they are struggling to sustain. The transplant team comes in and they see exactly the same person as a source of organs that will be used to sustain the life of somebody else. And so they see the exact same, physically objective body from very different moral perspectives. And I think the reason they switch teams like that is just so hard to flip it, to switch from seeing that body as someone you're trying to keep alive to seeing it as a source of organs for somebody else.
Yeah, but also, I mean, in different cultures, there is much more reluctance, right, to donate organs, right? So I think, even in the U.S., I mean, there's a lot of people that are, have qualms.
I mean, the U.S. is always, any generalization you want to make about the U.S., you can instantly find the opposite too.
Right.
So we're a particularly complicated case, but what I learned in doing the research for this book is that apparently Japan, in some sense, is in certain ways is a funny mirror image of the U.S. So there is apparently very little conflict over abortion rights in Japan, but there's a great deal of resistance to organ transplants, and the reason seems to be that the reasons are going to be more complex than I could have time to explain here. But one factor is organ transplants depend on the defining death with brain death. Historically, death was defined by either when you stop breathing or when your heart stops beating. But once your heart stops beating, you very quickly cannot use those organs anymore, as I said. So organ transplant wasn't really a viable option until we had the technology that allowed us to define somebody brain dead. In Japan, there's been a huge amount of resistance to this. As long as the heart is still beating, there's still a soul there. The person is still warm. Their flesh still has sort of a warm glow to it. And people just cannot accept that is not a living person. I mean, it is in some sense a phenomenological response to something that looks like a living body. Like my experience is, it's like the sun rises in the east. I know it doesn't rise in the east, but look, it rises in the east, right? And you could tell me that's a dead person, but they're warm. Their skin is, has that kind of living glow to it. Don't tell me they're dead. And so it's very hard to persuade people that it's okay to cut that person open and take out an organ.
But I think Japan is different in some other ways. I mean, it seems like there are some of these animist tendencies that persist, right? And you talk about the robot dogs, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the robot dogs have made bigger inroads in Japan than pretty much anywhere else. And you also read stories about people going on dates with cartoon characters and stuff like this. I mean, and it looks bizarre, right, from the outside, but it seems to be consistent with a slightly different kind of articulation of the boundary between what constitutes the human and the non-human, or the alive and the non-alive, or the animated and the non-animated.
Yeah. So, one of the themes that runs through the book is that in many situations that look like we have sort of dramatically different moral or ethical intuitions, the difference is less in what our moral intuitions are, but rather where we draw the line between us and them, between something to which it applies and something to which it doesn't. We may, in fact, share moral intuitions with people who seem utterly strange to us, but we just don't agree on where they apply properly. So the example you point to is the popularity of very sort of mimetically persuasive robot pet dogs in Japan, and when the dog breaks down and can't be repaired anymore, becomes obsolete, there are Buddhist temples that will perform mortuary, do death ceremonies for them. You can have a tablet in its honor and so forth. And there's been some controversy about what to make of this. So there's some people, non-Japanese people, who say, well, this is just a terrible thing because it proves that they're just deluded. They've fooled themselves and they're living this terrible illusion about, they persuaded themselves that these machines are actually living creatures. And then from the other side, there are those, some anthropologists got to know one of the Buddhist priests who runs one of these temples, and said, well, the priest says, people know perfectly well that these are machines. But they've found, but there's a kind of, in some sense, a form of play, and it's play in a very serious way. So if you think about how serious play can be, it doesn't mean that they're not serious about it, but they're also not operating under a delusion. So what do I mean by that? Well, you could watch an ancient Greek tragedy, say the story of Oedipus, and be deeply moved by it and feel deeply troubled by the story it has to tell you, without ever, and you could even enter into, what Aristotle called the willing suspension of disbelief, and sort of, at least momentarily, enter into the frame of the story full-heartedly with your full imagination, but you're not deluded. You're using the capacity for this kind of imaginative identification within a play frame to engage in a kind of moral reflection, to entertain possible worlds, to entertain, to sort of run through the range of possible way things could go, even if they're not real. What if I think Antigone is the example I use in the book. How do I handle the conflict between what I owe to my brother? I owe him a proper burial, and what I owe to the state, whose laws I must follow and whose laws have forbidden me from burying him. And how do I sort those out? Well, maybe it's better to sort them out on the stage than to sort them out to come to a situation where you have to sort them out with graver consequences.
But it seems like this suspension of disbelief, I mean, it's not so clear cut, right? Like, it's not a switch that we can flip on and off at will. I mean, it's not like, okay, I'm going to go into the movie theater and then I'm going to leave the movie theater. I mean, it's kind of, we're inhabiting this all the time. I mean, even at my age, like, I feel a little queasy about throwing out an old stuffed animal. I mean, there's something just a little,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm like, dude, it just doesn't feel right, And,
The Velveteen Rabbit story. I don't know if you remember that one, but I read that to my daughter. Yeah, these poor things. No, I think we do. I think it shows a very thin understanding of human beings to imagine that we don't have these kinds of relationships to objects, and different societies in different periods of history have sort of run with it, with the what I call the affordances that they offer us, and others have sort of not been as interested in it. So different, you could pick up with it and really develop it and elaborate it, or you could just have it linger there on the sidelines, your childhood toy, perhaps, that you don't take that seriously, but you're still not going to throw it out. But I quote to somebody who was very critical of the Japanese relation to Japanese robot pet dog owners' relationship to their robot pet dogs. He says they're operating under a delusion. And I say it's like, this is a guy who's never cried in the movies. I mean, you go to a really good movie. When I show Casablanca to my students, there's a moment in Casablanca I like to show in a class for particular purposes. I still get a tear in my eye at these certain romantic scenes. I know it's make-believe. I know it's pictures of some people, long dead people, acting out make-believe stories, but it's still moving.
Well, I mean, is there some kind of law of thermodynamics with respect to how, the sort of contours of the moral life exist? I mean, you speculated at one point in the book, or you cited somebody said, the story about the expanding moral circle that is the standard sort of, liberal story. I mean, are there things that contract when these things expand, right? So when we start saying, oh, it doesn't matter how old you are, what race you are, or whatever, you could be from a different culture, you're still human. I mean, we've seen that move happen in, recent times in the West and so forth. But are we at the same time contracting that circle in areas that we're unaware of?
I mean, we're very pleased with ourselves. It's a very self-congratulatory story that, once upon a time we only our moral rules only applied to our kinfolk or to our tribe, and everybody else we treated in these horrible, the rules don't apply to them. And then we expanded it, and eventually, we realized that, enslaving people wasn't good because they're human too, and good for us, and and then even women was, and so forth, and disabled people, and and we can pat ourselves on the back, but the first thing was in some ways the circle has shrunk in ways that I don't think worries any of us. That in the Middle Ages, animals could be punished for moral transgressions, and we don't do that anymore. So they've, in some sense, shifted positions in the moral circle in a certain direction. Acts of God are no longer attributed to like a real divine being. It's just a turn of phrase. But in Shakespeare's Macbeth, when kings misbehave, nature goes strange. Weird things start to happen. So in certain respects, things that used to be part of our moral circle have been excluded from it. More troubling, though, is we can congratulate ourselves if we tell the story, as one of continual expansion of our moral circle. But then the kinds of sort of mechanized, technologically mechanized mass scale genocide that is unique to the 20th and 21st centuries is new. Plantation slavery in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was new. So I'm a little wary of any linear story about history going in either direction. I think it's just there isn't a good simple story to tell there, and it's certainly not going in one direction, in my view.
Well, I mean, certainly when it comes to inanimate objects, we seem to have kind of contracted the circle, right? To some degree. You talk about the deodand. In the old days, like you mentioned, the Middle Ages, you could sue an animal or prosecute an animal for doing something. But even to this day, if your dog bites someone, you run the risk of having your dog put down. But if you hit someone with your car, you get the car patched up and you get it back. It doesn't get seized and by the state, right, or prosecuted as it may have in the past. And I think you point to some particular moment in time in legal history where this sort of stopped applying, right?
Yeah. So there was in deodand actually means given to God, and there was a medieval English law that a non-human thing that had killed or harmed a human could be was essentially held legally responsible in certain ways, and was taken from its owner and given to God in the form of the sovereign, the king or the queen, who was the representative of God on earth. And what brought an end to that law was the invention of the railroad. I get this story from the wonderful historian William Peets, who truly has written some fascinating things. And Peets tells the story. The very first railroad, I think it ran from Manchester to Liverpool, somewhere in the north of England, to London, and it was this great demonstration of the wonderful new invention, and everyone's turning out to see it, and the newspapers are all there to cover it, and there's marching bands and all this stuff. So it stops to fill the tanks with water. It's a steam engine. And it starts to move, and one of a member of parliament, one of the honorary people who's riding this train, had stood in front of it, and it kills him. The very first train ride in history kills somebody, and now there's a problem. What are you going to do with this? Is the railroad company going to have to, every time the train runs over a person? So the railroad companies basically work together with Parliament to get rid of the deodand laws, because they cannot operate comfortably if they are going to be vulnerable, if their trains are going to be taken away from them every time they do something bad. I mentioned this in the context of self-driving vehicles, which raise all sorts of wonderful questions about, what are the moral responsibilities of a self-driving vehicle if there isn't a person there, but it does something wrong? Is it the designers? Is it the person who was in the passenger seat? Is it the vehicle itself? It's not as simple as you might think when you start to try to work through the scenarios.
Yeah, and it seems like you could use certain design features to tap into people's anthropomorphism, right? So, if you put little eyeballs on the Roomba,
Hmm. Hmm.
then
Actually, it
people
turns out you don't even need to do that. People apparently love their Roombas. It's an overwhelming response. But ChatGPT and generative AI more generally are designed they are designed to prompt in us precisely these anthropomorphizing responses. They're extremely good at it, and this gets us back to where we started in the conversation. Talked about magic. What they seem to be magic in part because they're designed to prompt in us the kind of collaborative meaning making that humans do. Humans grow up from birth surrounded by other humans. By the time they encounter AI or anything else like that, they have a lifetime of knowing how to interact with other, this is what I would call semiotic beings that have language, that give off meaningful signals, but it's always a collaborative enterprise. It's not just me sending a signal to you and you sit inside your little brain and interpret my signal. We collaborate in the making of meetings and conversations, and we do that with computers, and then we attribute. It's very hard to resist attributing meaning making and sometimes even intentionality, and in some cases attributing sentience to them, because that's what we do. We're really good at doing that, and they're designed to provoke that response, to bring out that response. But we don't understand why it knows the things it knows and why it comes up with the answers it does. And this too is a design feature, both because of the amount of data that they've hoovered up, and because of the recursive training systems that they go through with large language models. Nobody can really explain exactly why any given instance an AI will come up with the answer that it gives you, and so it's hard not to respond to it as if it were magic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do it in slightly different ways. Like when we see a Roomba or an autonomous vehicle, we probably look at them in ways similar to the way we would look at individual animals, right? Because we would attribute some kind of agency to the object. But when we go, "Hey Siri," then we kind of also, we don't think of it as our phone. We think of it as some spiritual creature up in the clouds, right? So we were tapping more into our divine
right
analogy.
Because
right?
I mean, look at all the ways in which it's like it knows more than I do. In fact, it knows more than any human could possibly know. It seems to have this mysterious insight that's inexplicable. You don't know why it says what it says. It's disembodied. It's invisible. It's like God, right? It's like it has no body. It's like it's this transcendental being, and
we can pick our gods. Like you might have Claude and a god.
That's right. That's right. Well, people do pick their gods. People. I mean, this is what religious conversion is, in some sense. It's like, you know what, that god didn't work out. I'm moving to another one.
Mm-hmm.
That's back to my second book, right? This one's. Yeah, there's a better one, down the block, or there's something better on offer. I don't mean to be facetious because it's a very serious thing for people, but it is. There's always more than one option.
Well, you talk a lot about the perspective, right? First person, third person, second person perspective, and you say that we spend most of our life in the first person. I mean, is using the third person perspective, I mean, is this a skill or aptitude? Is this a practice? Does our culture encourage or discourage the use of third person perspective?
Basically, what I would say is I would disagree a little with the way you put that, because it's not that we always inhabit the first person and then have to learn how to get out of it. Because if you look at at the child socialization of language, how kids learn to speak, surprisingly early, when you consider how extraordinarily complicated this is, surprisingly early, kids learn how to master the flip between first person and second person when they're in a conversation. That is to say, when I'm speaking, the word I refers to me. When I stop speaking and Greg starts speaking, the word I refers to Greg. And Webb becomes the person who's referred to as you. And when you think about the kind of like cognitive flip-flopping that seems to require, it's not a straightforward matter, but kids learn that pretty early. Now, if in order to be able to pull that off, in some sense, you've got to implicitly understand that the person, when someone else is using the word I, and they're addressing me as you, it's already an invitation to see myself from the outside, to see myself from your point of view. And to really get good at conversation, you've got to be able to do that. So the next step in the cognitive development that's sort of relevant to this story is what we call child's theory of mind, which is you get to a point where it's very important to master, in the process of learning how to master ordinary conversation, to know the difference between what I know and what you know. So, they have these experiments with kids where the kid will know where something is hidden, but the other person doesn't know where the thing is hidden.
False belief test, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a test of whether the kid knows the difference between, what they know and what that other person knows. And this is you're already learning how to step outside of yourself. But there's always, every language also has a third person built into the form of interaction, which is a way. So the third person is someone who's not in the conversation. So, for example, if I were here talking to another person, and you, Greg, walks up and stands next to us, and I refer to Greg as him, in the third person, you might feel insulted. Why would you feel insulted? Because essentially I'm saying you're not here. You're not in our conversation. Even if you're standing a foot away, I'm not treating you as if you're part of this. In the process of learning how to do that, this is sort of another step in the sort of basic business of learning how to talk, which is how to see things from the outside, how to learn. This goes along with learning how to see yourself in categorical terms, of saying, I'm not just inside my head or inside my body, but I'm also early on learned that I am someone who is known to others as a member of this family, or a member of this tribe, or this category, this gender category, or this age grade, or this this lineage, or this clan, or this class. I'm a member of the proletariat, or what have you. That we start to do this pretty early on in life. It's just and when you see, if I were to see myself as a professor, I'm already seeing myself from the third person point of view. Professor is a category of which I am just one member. But you don't have to wait till you get to be a professor to do that. The minute you see yourself as, say, a member of a clan, in some sense you're seeing yourself as one item in a set. And is there yourself from the third person point of view.
I mean, presumably those categories are heterogeneous across cultures, but is there any heterogeneity with respect to people's capacity or propensity to perspective switch like that?
I think there's a difference in how it's valorized. So, Kant's categorical imperative, if you think about the history of Western philosophy, Kant's categorical imperative is essentially, it's a very sophisticated version of the Golden Rule. You should hold as a law to yourself that which you would hold to others. Is essentially saying, step outside of yourself and see yourself from the third. So this becomes really a bedrock conviction of a great deal of modern Western moral philosophy. But I would say Aristotle would have said categorical rules don't apply across the board. They apply to particular categories of people. So, what is a virtue for the warrior is not the same thing as a virtue for the slave or for a woman, right? Another variation on this would be, say, people who belong to very small, localized religious systems would say that, of course you have different gods from us. Our gods, your gods don't, our gods are good for us, but that doesn't mean they're good for you. And so in some sense, there are all sorts of ways. And then of course, there's some people who really emphasize subjectivity, give it a great value, and consider the kind of objectivism that's implicit in the third person stand as being in some sense alienating. Or, back to Weber, where we started, part of the kind of cold bureaucratic rationalization of the world that he sees as a very negative, something he was very good at, but also very worried about. Very thought that there's something human being lost there.
Yeah. Now, you said earlier that when you came back from your first field work, everything looked completely different, right? The things you took for granted were all of a sudden novel. I mean, is this an experience that, it seems like anybody who travels experiences this to some much smaller extent. And I wonder now, as we travel the world and everything is much more homogeneous, and you go to Nepal and they've got Taylor Swift on there, right? It's like, is it going to get harder for ordinary people to see the world afresh? Is this sort of anthropological way of looking at the world something that is itself a virtue? Is it something that's available to everybody?
Oh, I think so. I think anthropologists just do what everyone does. They just do it more intensely, and with more intentionality. As again I said, our most valuable tool is just knowing how to be a person, and how to get along with other people, and that in principle, anyone can learn a new language. Anyone can. You're never going to learn it as well as you learn your first language, but it's one of those. It's something that's available to you, and so in some sense, and that goes for learning learning to eat differently, to walk differently, to wear different kinds of, to interact with people differently, even to imagine yourself into a different kind of, metaphysical system. Like, hang out with shamans long enough, and you're going to start to think that, yes, they do turn into jaguars and, roam the forest at night.
Well, Webb, there's a lot of great stories in this book. It's a short book, but there's a ton of great stories, and each one set me off in a different direction and made me want to read some more books. So thanks so much for joining me. This book's called Animals, Robots, and Gods: Adventures in the Moral Imagination. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.